The 2024 Cairns Cup, one of the strongest female super tournaments of the year, kicked off today with the first round of classical action. This is the fourth edition of the event, and the format is a 10-player round robin featuring several of the world's top female players, including a couple of former women's world champions, Zhongyi, Alexandra Kosteniuk, and Mariya Muzychuk. Also playing in the tournament are three of the top U.S. female players, including the 8-time U.S. Women's Champion Grandmaster Irina Krush, the young International Master Alice Lee, and the reigning champion of the event, International Master Anna Zatonskih. Jumping into the results right off the bat, there were multiple decisive victories in today's first round. Alexandra Kosteniuk defeated Elisabeth Paehtz. Zhongyi scored a victory over Alice Lee, and Mariya Muzychuk defeated the previous champ Zatonskih in today's round. Going into today's games, we'll start with the game between Kosteniuk and Paehtz. This one started off as a Rossolimo Sicilian, with white capturing on c6 early, playing d3, and advancing e5. And this one got a very unbalanced position right out of the opening, with black taking on e5 here, d6, bishop g3, knight f5. And now Kosteniuk finds a very nice move here, knight h4, still played relatively quickly, so likely she was in her preparation for this one. If black takes on g3 here, then after f takes g3, white does get the open f-file. Black has to play g6 to avoid queen h5 check ideas, and the position would be quite complicated. Instead, we saw g6, knight d2, and trades on h4, bishop takes h4. This probably wasn't the best way for black to go, because now white does get a very serious advantage in this game, especially after knight e4 and knight f6 check. Here black could have played king f7, but Paehtz decides to trade on f6, and Kosteniuk here gets a very, very nice middle game with the opposite colored bishops. Now material is still equal here, but white actually has a very, very serious advantage, mainly because her bishop is going to be quite strong here compared to its counterpart, and black's king is long-term weak on the dark squares. So Kosteniuk builds this one up for quite some time. Queen h4 here, rook e2. Possibly black should have considered going for the endgame in this one, or playing a move like bishop to d5 to force white to trade on b4. But after Paehtz keeps the queens on the board, from here white's play becomes very, very easy, and Kosteniuk slowly builds up this pawn break here with d4 to open up the position. And here after d4, Paehtz makes a critical mistake with rook to h5. This actually turns out quite badly for black because it forces white's queen back to g3. Instead, black could have traded, for example, and then played a move like d5. The position is still worse for black, but kind of playable. Instead, after rook h5, queen to g3, now black's pawns are all hanging on this diagonal. After takes, Paehtz decided to play e4, giving up the d6 pawn in order to try and create a light square blockade, but it really wasn't enough. Now white's pieces can simply come in on the dark squares. b4 here, rook to c5, and Kosteniuk's technique in this one was very, very sound, breaking with b5 here. And as long as white has heavy pieces on the board, the opposite color bishops here are actually really, really dangerous for black's king. So Paehtz tried to defend this one, but at this point, black's king is essentially just way too weak to survive. The game did not last much longer here. Bishop to d6, bishop b7, and now takes, queen to g4, and this was the end of the game. Black resigns as white is about to deliver a mating attack here with queen h5 coming next. Moving on to the game between Alice Lee against Zhongyi. This one was quite an interesting game, and right out of the opening, Tan plays kind of a rare system with this early b6. Here I think queen c2 is critical, trying to play for a quick e4. Also, what Alice does here is one of the main continuations for white, with a3 and now d5 taking space in the center. But bishop to d6, knight f3, and quickly the players reach this very unusual structure with black's bishop on d6, and now c6 chipping away at white's structure. So Alice plays this one quite aggressively here with castles and bishop to g5. And now black plays h6 and g5, and this is definitely a critical moment. Here white has a choice, either bishop to g3, which would allow black to take the pawn on d5, so pawn sacrifice, or Alice could have taken on g5 here and sacrificed the piece. This one actually would have been rather unclear and maybe would have been the way to go. as these attacks can be very dangerous. Rook e1 is now coming for white, queen to d2, bishop f3, and so on. Again, the position would be very, very imbalanced, but possibly this was quite interesting from white's point of view. Instead, after bishop to g3, Alice decides to sacrifice the pawn on d5, and white definitely has compensation here as black's king side is rather weak, but ultimately she doesn't quite get enough. Maybe here knight e5 was a better choice, looking to plant the knight on g4 and then look to open up the rook with f4. Instead, after knight d4, Tan plays queen to f6, knight e6, and black slowly here starts to make use of the extra pawn. Now bishop e6, the knight drops back, bishop to c4, and rook fe8. Queen to d2, Alice does try to generate some play here on the king side. The knight gets to f5, but after g4, white just isn't creating enough threats here. Black takes on b2, now grabbing a second pawn, and at this point the position is actually very, very difficult for white. So knight takes h6, knight e4 now, can't take the knight because of the queen on d2. Queen to d1, knight to c3, and at this point black takes over. Knight e2 check, knight to f4, g3, and now bishop to e2. Very, very nice move, hitting the queen. White's bishop on c2 is hanging, and black has this idea of playing queen h8 in the future to pick up this knight on h6. So Alice tries to go for the endgame here with queen to b3, but black takes, and black is still up material from before, so this one does end up being a winning endgame for the current Women's World Championship challenger, Tan Zhongyi. Rook d8 now, bishop takes f7, and the game ended here with knight takes c1, rook takes c1, rook to e7, knight f5, and nice sequence here by black. King takes f7, knight takes e7. Black was up the exchange, but decides to give it back as she has this killer move in the position, bishop to f3, where the threat of rook h8 is very, very strong, threatening mate in 2, and white is forced to give up the knight in order to stave off checkmate. So that's what Alice did with knight to f5, rook h8, and knight to h4, but there really wasn't a lot of saving chances for white in this one. Black simply has too many extra pawns on the queen side along with the extra piece, and it took a little while, but Tan's endgame technique here was definitely more than satisfactory, and eventually she does convert this one by making a passed b pawn. White tries to get something going with the king side pawns, but of course the extra bishop here is way too strong, and soon one pawn falls. The second pawn is soon going to fall as well, and in this position Alice did resign. Moving on to our third decisive game, this one between Grandmaster Mariya Muzychuk against I am Anna Zatonskih. This one started off as a French defense, with white going for the classical setup here with knight f3, bishop to e3, black playing for a6 and queenside expansion. b6 here, g3. Both players actually developing quite normally for this type of position. But white does get kind of a nice typical French here with c3 coming and a big space advantage in the center of the board. So c3 and now f5. And at this point, Muzychuk takes on f6 on Paehtz. Apparently it was stronger to just leave the pawn on f5, play a move like knight to g5. Going after the e6 pawn, black might have to take here on g5 with the bishop, and after bishop takes g5, f takes g, the second knight can come to f4, and it looks like white would have quite a good game here. Instead, we saw on Paehtz and bishop to h3, white going after the e6 pawn, and this one actually got quite complicated here. Despite white's position being good, Muzychuk does allow Zatonskih a chance here in just a couple moves. After bishop to d7, bishop c1, rook f8, both sides building up, g5, knight e7, rook to e1, knight g6. And after knight h5, black had the chance to break free here with the move e5, a really cool resource. The point is that if bishop takes d7, then there's going to be queen takes d7 to recapture, and after takes and takes, black's queen is eyeing the g4 square, and black is actually doing really, really well here according to the engines. Of course, there's some complicated computer stuff. For example, there might be some sacrifices looming on e5, but apparently this was black's chance. Instead, we saw knight to h4. Now bishop to g4, b5, rook e5, knight back to g6, and here Muzychuk sacrifices the exchange. Rook takes e6, takes and now takes, and this ends up giving white some very, very nice attacking chances in the position. She follows up with h3. The position very, very difficult for black to play. Queen to c7. Now the simple f5 here is just good for white, pushing forward the massive kingside pawns. Instead, Muzychuk decides to sacrifice the second exchange. The rook takes g6, and now queen takes g6. It's actually not a bad idea at all, as white's two pieces for black's two rooks are definitely very, very active here. White's pawns are very, very strong, and black's pieces just have a hard time of getting into the game. So queen e7 was the continuation. Now bishop to e6, and white is just playing for the full grip, f5. And at this point, Zatonskih makes a critical mistake with rook to e7. She needed to move the rook elsewhere, like rook to b7, c7, a7, for example. Here, the problem after rook e7, knight f4, is that white is going to be winning their material back, at least some of their material, after an incoming knight to g6 check. So winning one exchange back and then having a lot of strong pawns on the king side afterwards. So rook takes e6 was played. Now queen takes e6, takes, knight takes e6, and white's pieces here are still completely dominating the pawns on the king side, very, very strong. Black played rook e8, keeping the bishop on d8 defended, g6, and now white just has this absolute grip on the position. And from here, it really was just a matter of technique. As black has nothing to do but to sit and wait, white makes sure that the bishop doesn't get in. Now bishop to e5. And king to c2, dealing with any queenside counterplay. Bishop f6 was played. I think this makes white's life a little bit easier, as now white can trade bishops and advance h4, h5 as happened in the game. Zatonskih is finally able to open up the rook, but there's nowhere to enter, so she's forced to just sit passively. And at this point, white eventually brings the king back around to the king side to prepare the final breakthrough. And the finish here was quite instructive. h7 check, knight f7, rook e8 forced. White simply makes a new queen. Black has to give the rook back, and now the king and pawn endgame is winning for white. So well calculated by Muzychuk here. And after g7, black is forced to vacate the promotion square with the king on g8, and at this point, black resigned. Next up, we have the game between Irina Krush and Anna Muzychuk. This one started off with the queen's gambit declined. Got the classic Carlsbad structure here. And this was a pretty solid game, but here in the middle game, Muzychuk does make a mistake. After making this exchange with d4, trading off the isolated queen pawn, it seems like black's position here should be totally fine. For example, after trading on e2, things should be about equal. But instead, queen a5 was played. This move ends up giving white some chances, because now Irina finds knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, nice move, bishop to c4, starting to activate the pieces. Here black plays bishop to e5, white trades on e5, rook takes e5, and at this point the engine was showing the move queen to d6 as being quite strong for white, with ideas of sacrificing the bishop on f7, followed up by bringing the knight to d5, and then entering with the rook on c7. Kind of some deep computer tactics here, but looks like white had quite a bit of a chance to get the initiative there. Instead, Irina played knight to d5, which is also quite reasonable, because after queen takes d2, she gets to insert knight takes f6 check, forcing black to weaken the structure. And now after rook takes d2, white does have quite a pleasant endgame here, as her structure has a lot fewer weaknesses. So g4, now rook to d7, the rook gets into the 7th rank. Rook f8 here played rook to e1, king to g7. At this point, maybe the immediate f4 would have given white the best chances to try and convert this one, followed by bringing in the king. But instead we saw rook to c7, b5, f4 now, rook e8, bishop drops back to b3, and black is in time here. f5 takes and king f6. Very good defense here by Anna Muzychuk, just sacrificing a pawn to get the king in and looking for some activity. And at this point, white is able to keep the extra pawn here. Bishop takes f7, but it's not really enough, as black just has tons of activity here and full compensation for the pawn, especially after rook to d8. The rook is now entering on the d file. So bishop g6 check was played, forcing a trade of bishops. Black gets the rook in, rook takes b2, and the players soon made a draw in this rook endgame, which is of course completely equal, as all the pawns slowly got traded off. And yeah, eventually a draw was agreed in this one. The final game of the round was between Harika Dronavalli against Nana Dzagnidze. This one started off as a Sicilian defense and was quite solid for the first part here, but eventually gets quite interesting as Nana here plays the move queen to c7, allowing white to take on f6 and spoil black's structure on the king side. Eventually, Harika does do this and starts playing against black's king here with queen to f3 and queen h5. And in this one, Harika plays very, very aggressively, actually sacrificing a lot of material here, offering in order to play for mate. Here after f5, for example, if black was to take the knight on c3, white would follow up with the move rook to f4, and black's king is in huge, huge danger here. Instead, we saw king to h8, knight e2, and here Dzagnidze does grab some material with queen takes c2, knight d4, white takes on c6, and now e5, sacrificing another pawn. Queen takes e5, trades on e6, takes, and now rook f e1. And white has tons of compensation here, of course, with the presence of opposite color bishops. Once again, these favor the attacker, but Dzagnidze finds an absolutely fantastic defensive move here, rook a d8. Taking advantage of white's weakened back rank, if white takes on e5 here, then black gets a ton of material after rook takes d1 check. White is going to be giving up the bishop here as well as the rook on e5, and black is going to be completely winning. So instead, in the game, we got rook to c1 and now queen to g5, and maybe Harika shouldn't have traded pawns on e6 because it allows this resource with queen to g5, forcing the queen trade. And at this point, black has basically fixed their king. In the endgame, the king is a lot safer. And it's now black that starts playing for the win, as she is able to get an extra pawn in this endgame. That said, it was opposite color bishops, so Harika was holding this one throughout the entire endgame. But this one did go on for some time as Dzagnidze looks to convert her advantage. And we even eventually get the rook and bishop versus rook endgame here, which Harika had to hold as white for 50 moves, but she did manage to eventually hold this one for all 50 moves. It was quite a long game. We see here soon white will have to give up the bishop for the g-pawn, which is about the maximum that black could have hoped to achieve in this endgame. But yeah, Harika knew her stuff here, and eventually a draw was agreed in this one as well. That brings us into tomorrow's round 2, where we have a number of already critical matchups, including the battle between Zhongyi taking white against Irina Krush. We have Paehtz white against Alice Lee, Dronavalli white against Kosteniuk, and plenty of more interesting matches coming up. Hopefully you folks enjoy the recap, and until next time, take care.